Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching, and this is the third Great Unclean one to feature on the channel in a very pale, unusual colour scheme. Now I've never seen a colour scheme with a Great Unclean one done really pale. I'm sure they're out there, I'm sure people have done them, probably done them better than I have. But this is a fairly quick scheme and it was a bit of an experiment. I wasn't really sure how it was going to go. Now I'm starting off like I've started the previous two Great Unclean ones, using Games Workshop contrast paints. Now in some ways these are, super fast paints to use, super easy, and you think, oh, it's like a beginner format. But in other ways, actually, you've got to be a lot more careful about how you use them. We'll talk about that in a second. Now this model's been sprayed black and then sprayed with a Wraithbone spray over the top. You can see there I've been quite thorough with that Wraithbone spray, but not got into all the gaps and cracks, so there's areas where it's a little bit darker, and that helps the contrast paint. Now what you saw me do there was mix the contrast paint, and we're starting off with the Apothecary White, and I did a mix of 50-50 contrast paint and contrast medium. And what I'm doing as I'm starting, I'm putting that 50-50 mix on the raised areas, then putting the Apothecary White everywhere else, and that kind of makes those raised areas a little bit paler than even the contrast paint works. Contrast paint works by obviously settling into the gaps and cracks, doing all your highlights for you. I wanted to just push that a little bit further, so I did that 50-50 mix and used the 50-50 mix and the normal paint. Now you saw there I dropped in some Gulliman flesh onto the cracked skin areas. I also put that on the mouth and lips later on. And what I'm doing is, as I'm working through the skin, as I hit the areas that I want to use with the colours, I'm doing it then and there and then moving on later. So you see here yellow on the areas where the skin's been rent and you've got the kind of fatty fleshy bits kind of showing through. So as I'm working around, I'm using the two types of the Apothecary White, and then when I hit those yellow flesh areas, doing that, and then doing the areas with the Gulliman flesh, just so it blends in as you're kind of painting it, and it mixes the paint together a little bit on the edges. Now when I've done all the skin, it's time to move on to the tentacles. Now with this scheme, because it's going to be a very pale kind of flesh scheme, I wanted to sort of bring the sort of contrasting colours onto the tentacles and the horns later. So I'm putting that basilicanum grey onto all the tentacles to really sort of darken that down. And rather than on the horns, doing it with a bone colour that I've done previously on the other Great Unclean ones, doing it into this black to really make a real nice black kind of horns, and onto the teeth and the fingernails and all those kind of areas there. So really I'm working off a fairly monochrome palette, but then with the yellows to bring out that kind of pop of colour in there. You'll also see that the little ears, I don't know if you know it is that, I've done that with the Gulliman flesh as well. Now we're getting into the sort of stomach areas, and this does match the scheme I've done before. Going in with a Volupus Pink, which is a really nice colour just to get all the guts and things that are bursting out the stomach and, really add that kind of vibrancy to it. Now at this stage of the paint scheme, I really wasn't sure if this was going to work, and as I was doing it I was a bit like, here we go. But prepared to experiment, you can always just strip the paint off and start again if you make a mess. And talk about making messes, this is why I think contrast paints, even though they are a quick, easy technique, actually they can be more difficult to paint with, because I do find if you make a mistake with contrast paint and it goes onto an area you've already painted, it's a lot harder to clean up, I think anyway, than standard paint. So when you're doing this, be really, really careful, try and stay within the lines, don't drip paint on anything, just kind of be that little bit careful. And the reason for that being, I think, is if you drop a paint onto an area you've previously done, you can't just go back to the original paint and paint over it like you can with standard paints. You basically have to go straight back to the base colour, do the first layer of contrast again, so it's harder to clean up the mess, that's what I think. But it gives a really nice effect on larger models like this, really does speed you up, just got to be a bit careful. So you can see after the Volupus Pink on the guts there, I did the Majos Purple into the other gut areas, because the vibrant sort of stomach area I wanted in one colour, slightly bit less in the other. Skeleton Horde onto the base. Not really going to talk about how I do the base on this because it's how I've done it on the other models, but just doing that onto the skeletons on the base there, and then into the leather colour. Now the top left of the screen, I've been putting the colours, I've been using them and going along, and that is really just inspiration, and that's all I'm trying to do on the channel, is kind of show you what I'm doing. You might not like it, you might do, sometimes these schemes don't come out as good as they could have done potentially, but yeah, just hopefully it shows you a little bit of inspiration and sort of part of my method. Now this is moving on to now the standard paint. Putting a Vallejo deep yellow onto all the little pustules and boils and things that are covering this model. And that's an awful lot of them. This was probably the most time consuming part of this paint scheme, catching all these areas of pustules and things. Nice paint scheme. It's Sunday morning, I'm now doing this voiceover. I actually started this paint job Saturday morning about 5 o'clock. I was off work for the weekend, been away at a conference for most of this week. If you follow me on Instagram, you know I did that. So this was a very fast paint scheme. A couple of hours on Saturday morning, couple of hours on Sunday morning before doing this voiceover, literally probably half an hour before the video gets posted at sort of 10 o'clock. I normally try and post about 8 o'clock in the morning. week's been very, very busy for me, so it's going to go a bit later. So just to show you, this is a very, very fast way of doing models. Moving on to metallics. So this is just a gunmetal onto all the chainmail pieces, onto the parts of the sword we'll come to in a second. And again, be really super careful when you're doing this. The biggest part about painting any model, I think, is just being as neat and tidy as you can. And that really does sort of help the final effect. Now on the kind of big dagger he's got into his arm there, I'm not going onto the skulls with the metal. We're going to come back to that in a second and do those brass, but just covering all the sort of metallic areas on the model. Now moving on to the Retributor armour, and again, be super careful. You see here I do actually make a mistake and I end up painting some of that Retributor armour onto the sort of silver edging of the weapon there. Again, before it has a chance to dry, go back with your wet brush and just get that off. Now this is something that is easier to do on standard paints, I find, than if it was a, you know, like we talked before, the contrast paints, but just showing you, if you make a mistake, fix it then and there, or at least try to, and it does help you out a lot later on. And I'm not someone that paints entire models without making a mistake. Absolutely, mistakes happen. Now when all the base coats are dried, be really careful with the contrast. So, you know, you've got to make sure the contrast is fully dried, which the standard paints are dried. It's now wash stage, and I'm going over the entire model with Games Workshop Sepia Shade. Now, if you've watched a lot of my videos before, especially my Death Guard stuff, I tend to use a Vallejo shade, which is a lot dirtier and grimier, because I'm going for a real speed paint kind of thing with this one here. I'm using the Games Workshop Seraphim Sepia. It's a bit of a cleaner wash. It does dirty the model down, but it doesn't make it so dirty that you've got to go and recover all of the kind of flesh areas. And I wanted it to be a fairly quick one, not have to do much extra work after it's dried. Now you can see on the skin here on the camera, it looks slightly bluey. Now after that wash has been on, it actually brings it down and makes the skin a bit more of a pale grey. Now that's what the model looked like after the wash had dried, and you could absolutely leave it there and call that scheme done. But I want to do a few extra bits on top. Now I'm working here on the bone, and I've not shown you how I painted the Nurgling on there, because that's for a different video. It's really more about the Great Unclean one. But I just bring up the bone level with here, and just some extra little highlights with a bone white colour. Then moving on to the skin with some tiny highlights, mostly around the face, of a grey colour that just makes the face pop a little bit. You definitely don't have to do it, and you can barely notice that you've even done it. Quick dry brush here with Rise of Rust, which is a really nice kind of orangey technical paint that Games Workshop do. Very little comes off, but again in the flesh it just gives a nice orangey sheen to the sword there, and just makes it that little bit mankier. Typhus Corrosion, a great technical paint, and again this adds a bit of texture to it. So this has actually got texture built into this paint, only going on edges and certain patches, and it gives a nice sort of browny textured rusty area to the sword. Again, not necessary, you know, from a distance you won't even know this has been done, but when you get close up and the model's in your hand, you can see that this has been given that little bit of extra texture. Now, brass doesn't rust, it oxidizes. So nylon oxide is a great paint, and it puts that kind of bluey oxidized that you will see on statues around the world kind of on there. But I didn't like what it was looking like on the actual brass. I thought the brass was still a bit too bright. So back to it, put some Mortarian grime all over the bell area, and smeared that all over there to make it just a bit dirtier. It was a bit too clean and pristine. Didn't like that, wasn't quite happy with it, so I went back with Agrax Earthshade whilst the Mortarian grime was still wet. So the bell has now had a kind of 2 wash layer over the top to really grime it up and make it that little bit mankier. And when that dried, I was quite happy with it. Completely forgot to film putting Nylon Oxide back over the top, but just the Nylon Oxide in a few patches. And now it's back to the absolute best Nurgle paint you're ever going to find, Nurgle's Rot. And this here is after I've varnished the model, so the model has been varnished, and then put Nurgle's Rot on afterwards, and that's because the Nurgle's Rot's got that kind of nice grimy, horrible, gooey sheen to it, and if you varnish over the top of it, that sheen goes away. So putting that onto all the pustules, the rent areas, the skin, to give that kind of gross Nurgle kind of sticky, wet gooiness, and it's a weird description, but absolutely one of the best paints if you're going to do a Nurgle army. Also a great paint for doing kind of, you know, seeping toxic goo onto bases and things. So that is basically the model completed. Do a quick spin round in my hands so you can see where they're at there. Yeah, really happy with how this model came out. Completely different to the 2 Great Unclean ones I've done. I think it makes a real nice kind of difference. Not sure I like the colour scheme as much as the other 2 Great Unclean ones. It is very different. Again, I've never seen a pale Great Unclean one before, but I really like how it's kind of finalised out, and it will look nice along with the 2 to give some real visual difference in the, you know, Servants of Nurgle that we're doing. So I hope you did like that. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you again on another video. Thanks everyone.